Today I've got my top 5 mistakes you want to avoid in your language classroom. Stick around until the end, where I'll share with you a successful strategy to get your students proficient fast. My name is Scott, and you're watching Immediate Immersion, where we're all about comprehension-based instruction in the modern language classroom. We'll be right back. Number 5, not providing enough comprehensible input. One of the big issues that I see with CI teachers is not providing enough comprehensible input. They think because they teach lower levels that they can't speak that much of the target language or their students will get lost. Wrong. The more comprehensible input you provide, the faster your students will acquire language. The key is to be sure it's comprehended. Write all new words on the board with their translation. This will be a long list for true beginners because you'll have to write down every version of the or in the language. But as your students' proficiency grows, you'll be writing down less and less words. It's also important to let students know that this is not a vocabulary list to memorize for a test. It's just so that they can understand what you say when you say it. Number 4. Focusing too much on grammar. I get it. Most of us were taught using grammar rules. But statistically, most people taught using grammar rules never really become proficient in the language. As Bill Van Patten says, language is too complex to reduce to simple rules, and it's much better to acquire grammar rules in context than to try to explain them. Grammar rules can be complicated, require a lot of processing, and often have many exceptions that make applying them in the moment an impossible task. Instead of talking all about the grammar of the language, expose your students to a wide variety of sentences and grammar in context so that they can acquire how the language works naturally. If a student asks a grammar question, answer just the question they ask and refrain from going into a long grammar explanation. I'm guilty of this all of the time. Number 3, focusing on thematic vocabulary. It makes sense. You learn the word for kitchen, and it seems only natural to learn all the rooms of the house at the same time. It may sound natural, but it's nothing of the sort. No parent in the history of parenting teaches their children language that way. They talk to their children about what is interesting to their children, and the language acquisition process starts. Children learn words and sentences that are most important to them first. If they like snakes rather than dogs, then the word snake will make it into their vocabulary before the word dog. But that doesn't mean that they will then go on to learn all of the words for different reptiles. Thematic vocabulary seems really easy to teach, but it tries to expand a student's vocabulary way too fast, and often with words that are not high frequency or have a high usefulness. Take, for example, the playground vocabulary. Unless you have young children, how often do you use the words swing set, slide, and jungle gym? Probably not very often. But word themes like this are often required by textbooks and assessments that go along with them. Number 2, not being comprehensible. We touched on this with number 5, but it can't be stressed enough. Terry Waltz always says that it's not enough to be comprehensible. You have to be comprehended. Just because you think that you're being comprehensible, if your students are not comprehending, you're not being comprehended. And language that is not comprehended is just noise. So we must work hard to make sure even our slowest processors are understanding what we are saying. Using visuals, board translations, and actions, we can make the language we use more comprehended for all students. Sticking to a core vocabulary and adding new words slowly also helps tremendously with comprehension. But don't stay away from longer, complex sentences. Your top students need to hear them. but break them down and scaffold them first using smaller, less complex sentences. This allows slower processors to understand while also giving examples of more complex sentences for those students who are ready for them. Number 1, not going slowly enough. Going slow is one of the hardest things for a teacher to do, but it's extremely important for the success of all students. We think we're going slow enough, but if you ask your students, they'll tell you that you are not. We often talk too fast, and students can't keep up. But when teachers are told this, they'll often slow down each and every word instead of pausing between natural breaks in the sentence. Students should be able to hear each word, but also hear how the cadence works in a sentence. And going slowly doesn't just mean your speaking cadence, but also moving through material. A textbook and pacing guide can often be the enemy of good teaching when we allow the calendar to dictate the pacing of our lessons instead of listening to our students. In CI, we often say, teach students, not curriculum. And what we mean by this is at the pace of your students can handle without leaving them behind. Who cares if you get to the end of the textbook in May if most of your students were left behind back in October? Less is often more, especially when it comes to acquiring language. Having a solid foundation on which to build is much more important than having a heck of a lot of loose bricks. So here's that successful strategy that I talked about in the beginning of the video. Mike Pito spearheaded this idea of creating a 4-year curriculum around the sweet 16 verbs. He said that if we focused on these 16 core verbs, students would have a solid foundation to communicate and to continue to build language upon. It's what we base our curriculum on at my district, and you can download my free Sweet 16 cheat sheet at mm.us/lessismore. So there you go, my top 5 mistakes to avoid in your language classroom. If you found these tips helpful, hitting the like button would be amazing, and consider subscribing if you want more videos on teaching in the modern language classroom. Want to watch more? Click on one of the videos YouTube has picked out for you. Happy comprehensible input!